Hey everyone, it's Jenny. Today I'm going to be showing you 3 cards and it features 3 different ways to use stencils with heat embossing. I'm going to be stepping up each one of them a little bit so you can see the evolution of the technique, and they all feature the Wow Dockside Trio, which is a gorgeous trio. It features 3 beautiful powders. I'll give you a close-up look at it in a minute. The stencils I'm using today are all by Gina Designs and they all feature a mandala or sort of snowflake type pattern. I'm going to stick the stencils down onto my cardstock with this PIXIE spray, which is a temporary spray adhesive. And here's a quick look at the trio. I'll give you a close-up look as we go, and these are the 3 colours that are featured in the Dockside Trio by Firth-Young. Now the cardstock I'm using today is the Wow Embossing cardstock. It is in A5, UK size A5, and I wanted to use this even though it's going to be bigger than my card front because I wasn't quite sure how I was going to trim down the images, the stenciled images. So I've sprayed PIXIE spray onto the back of my stencil, and then I'm going to use my Wow Embossing ink pad and just push it through, and sorry for the wobble, my camera tripod was a little bit unstable. I'm going to push it through the stencil, making sure that I get it good and inky through those holes, and then peel back the stencil. I did treat my cardstock with a powder tool before I added my stencil, and I did let that PIXIE spray dry on the back of the stencil, and that way you get less excess powder sticking where you don't want it once you peel back the stencil. I'm then adding sparkling sand, which is an embossing glitter from the Dockside Trio, which is gorgeous. I love this colour so much. It's like a pale, look at that, pale gold, almost like that platinum colour, but kind of a little bit warmer, a little bit golder, but not gold as your other golds. That's the best way I can find to describe it. A little bit like sand, good name for it. Now for my second one, I'm going to add the stencil down just off the edge of an A2 size panel. And you'll see why in a minute. I've lined it up so that the top and bottom of the stencil is exactly lined with the top corner and bottom corner of my panel. And then I'm going to add my embossing ink through the stencil as I did before. Be careful when you're doing this not to go over the edge of the stencil, otherwise you'll get ink where you don't want it on the clean side of the card. And this time I'm using the oiled slate. This powder is an opaque powder, the same as the sparkling sand, but instead of having glitter, it's like a mix of metallics. I think there's copper and black and gold and silver, I'm not quite sure, but it's all mixed in there together and it gives you this wonderful kind of almost like an oil slick, kind of a dark black gold copper colour once it's heated up. And you'll see I did get some powder sticking where I didn't want it there, and even though I did use my powder tool, so I'm just using a tiny paintbrush. It's dry and it's the one I use for removing excess powder, and then I've heated it up with my heat tool, and look at that, it's like it's really hard to explain, it's like a base of black with lots of dark metallic colours in it. Now for this one I'm going to step it up a little bit. So I have one of my favourite embossing glitters here. This is the Neutral Ultra Shimmer, which is lots of holographic glitter embedded with clear embossing powder. It's really subtle, really pretty, and I'm going to make my own glitter paste with this holographic embossing powder just by using some translucent embossing paste. This one is by Dreamweaver, you can get other brands, and when it dries clear. That's really important to know. This won't work with an opaque white embossing paste. And I squeeze some out on my craft mat, mix in some of the embossing powder. You can also do this with glass slipper sparkles from Wow, which are just not embossing powder. And I mix it in with a palette knife, add more if I need to, and then just keep adding it until I've got the texture and the look I want. And by the way, you can do this with any of the embossing powders or any of the embossing glitters or the sparkles. I've placed my stencil back over my previous heat embossing and lined it up perfectly, and then I'm just smearing over some of that DIY embossing paste, and then I'm going to set it aside to dry, and it will dry clear, and what you'll find is you get this gorgeous shimmery look over the top of that oiled metallic embossing powder, and it looks gorgeous. I'll show you a close-up of it in a bit. Now for my last card, I'm using this last stencil off to the side. I'm going to add it twice, and I'm using up the rest of that Neutral Ultra Shimmer DIY embossing paste. So I've placed it over the top corner, and I'm going to flip it round and then go back in and add it again. And you could leave it at that. You get, once it's dry, this gorgeous shimmery, almost snowflake look on a card. But I'm going to go in with Glassy Ocean, which is the third powder in that trio. And this one is translucent. That means that when it dries, it is, or when it's heated up, I should say, you can see through it. But I'm using white cardstock here, so that colour is going to show up perfectly. I'm just going to sprinkle some on the top of my embossing paste. And whilst I completely coated this first snowflake, I actually thought, you know what, I'm going to just sprinkle a little bit on the larger one so that I get a nice blend with patches of white and patches of the glassy embossing powder. And then I'm going to heat it up. You can heat up embossing paste. It does have a tendency to bubble, so I'm using setting 1 on my heat tool, which is not as hot. And then it will take a little bit longer to dry or heat up than you would normally expect with your embossing powder because you're using that lower setting. And look at that, you get this gorgeous shimmery look and it's raised with fabulous dimension. Now I'm keeping all 3 of my cards clean and simple with a similar look. I'm using this Stronger Together stamp set from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to stamp my first 2 sentiments just in VersaFine Onyx Black ink. This one is directly onto the panel. I just love the look of these sentiments. They're so kind of bold and just, this one is particularly a favourite of mine. And I'm going to just stamp it directly onto that card panel and then back them onto a white note card just to give it a bit more sturdiness. Text me, whatever. For my third one, I decided to heat emboss it in black, onto black with some opaque bright white embossing powder. So I'm going to treat that black cardstock with my powder tool first because any stray specks of white embossing powder will show up. Add my embossing ink, stamp it down, and then heat emboss in white. Opaque bright white. This one is the super fine. You can also use the regular grade for chunkier sentiments, and I probably should have for this one given that heart. And then I'm going to die cut out the sentiment with one of these circle dies and pop it into the center of my heat embossed Stencils snowflake, which I did trim down, so it stayed at 5.5 lengthways, but I trimmed it down on either edge and then popped it up on foam tape before I added it to my card base, and that Miss You was just popped up on some foam squares. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to head on over to the Wow YouTube channel. There's tons of other great tutorials over there. This video first appeared over there. Have an awesome day. Bye.